Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the best practices. As we have been changing due the restrictions thanks to COVID, we have been adopted this new format to be reaching all the growers in Nova Scotia and to be able to spread the voice about the Nova Scotian conditions. In this 2021, we'll be changing a little bit the format. We'll be starting with a researcher or somebody who is doing any kind of investigation in our area. And after we'll continue with the classical climatic report and update from Franklin, and a brief presentation about practices in our area, and finishing with our discussion with two growers. So before starting, I would like to give the word to Steve Ells to present and welcome this season. Steve.
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome back to, I guess this is our third year, Francisco, second year virtually, third year overall. So it's really great to be doing this again, and hope we can have good messages and a lot of good information out to everyone. I want to thank Perennia for taking the lead on this year, and Grape Growers Association is really happy to be able to collaborate with Perennia and bring you these sessions. It's kind of, they'll be spread out throughout the season, and we'll try to have timely topics the whole way through, right through to harvest and after. So with that, thanks everyone for joining in, and I'll turn it over to Harrison Wright, who's going to give us all the results from the bud hardiness testing and beyond. So go ahead, Harrison.
Again, Stephen, thanks Francisco for inviting me to talk a little bit about bud hardiness today. I'll talk about wine grape bud hardiness and viability and frost tolerance. This is a work that's a bud hardiness survey. Myself and you're familiar with Jeff sends out reports every week to GGANS. So a little bit overview of what I'll be talking about. First, we'll talk about bud hardiness, and we thought it might be interesting just to compare and contrast the last 3 years and the bud hardiness levels we got, and a few of the staple varieties that we do in the survey. I thought it'd be interesting to talk about high temperature exotherms. We're always talking about low temperature exotherms, but so I thought I'd mention what high temperature exotherms are, because they become a little bit problematic this time of year, and why they become a little tricky this time of year when trying to look at the low temperature exotherms. Finally, most of you are familiar, I've talked about it before anyway, about the bud viability survey. We've now done that for 2 years, where we look at 10 canes from about 10 sites, and we bring them back every 4 weeks, not as frequent as the bud surveys, just to see how the bud viability itself is actually changing over the dormant season, if at all. And finally, I just thought I'd end with a few minutes just talking about freeze damage around bud break. How a lot of people are wondering right now, as we're getting close to bud break, how sensitive their buds are this time of year. So bud hardiness the last 3 years. So I'll just do it a cultivar at a time, and you can see here the solid line is the present year, 2020, 2021, the dormant season, 2020, 2021. The dashed line is last year. And then the dotted line is 2 years ago, also known as the June frost year. So a couple of things to note in all these plots is one, you see last year in 2019, 2020, we kind of stopped a little bit early. We stopped in March. I don't think I have to explain why that was, given that we're all doing this virtually right now. And then also we had a little bit of a late start this year. Again, took a while for us to figure out within the federal government what things were going to look like this year in terms of restrictions and what we were going to be allowed to do and not do. So unfortunately, we weren't able to start till about the first week of December this year. So anyway, that aside, a couple of interesting things, or a couple of things to note is, for one, I thought it was kind of interesting. You can see in November, we usually start at the end of October or the beginning of November. And the June frost year was actually started out very hardy that year for almost all cultivars. You can see it came in right away in late October at around -17 or -18, which is a little bit unusual. I think this is probably because so many vines had so little crop on them that year. So maybe they started getting hurt because they didn't have fruit so early. Maybe they started getting ready for winter a little bit early as well. Another thing that you'll note is, at least in most cultivars, and Lackady is not an exception, you'll see that that we're actually quite a bit deacclimated this year compared to past years. We're already 2 or 3 degrees deacclimated or less hardy right now than in past years. I'll switch to Marquette. Oh no, hang on a second. First, I'll talk about this. So you see, I mean, they look kind of wiggly, these lines, and Lackady, it's sort of responsive, not as responsive as some of them, but you can see, for instance, in this year, the solid line, it kind of bumps up and down, and you can see a little bit of a bump up here where I've got the red circle in early February. That corresponds with a little bit of heat we got in early February. So these vines are responsive even in the wintertime, and they can deacclimate, and then if it cools down after a little bit of heat, they can acclimate again. Okay, next I'll go to the Marquette. One thing is you'll notice that everything shifts down about 3 degrees. If I go back and forth, that's Lackady, this is Marquette. So again, the solid line is this year, and the dashed line is last year, and the dotted line is the frost year, 2018. You can see another thing you notice, not only does it shift down, but it becomes quite bumpy, the Marquette. They're always going up and down. Again, you'll notice the June year, the frost year, again, a lot of Marquette. Well, some sites anyway, that influenced the average. Some sites didn't have a lot of fruit probably, and they came in pretty hardy. You also notice Marquette, they're very quick to deacclimate in the spring. They're one of the first to break bud. And you'll see it started to rise above past years here as well. Again, it's another 2 or 3 degrees deacclimated compared to past years. You also note, again, I said it's quite bumpy. It responds very quickly, Marquette. It's one of our shortest season grapes. It breaks the earliest. It also tends to shut down the earliest. It doesn't need as long a season as, say, Riesling. And when in the winter, when it's dormant, if it sees little heat like we had in February, you remember the little tiny bump we had on the Lackady, well, in the Marquette, it's quite a big bump. It actually deacclimated about 2, if not 3 degrees with that heat we had in February. But then you can see once it cooled down again, it actually went back down to close to -30, -31 even. And then once we started getting some heat in late March and stuff, it quickly deacclimated, and we're expecting bud burst in that cultivar in the KRDC vineyard anyway, any day now probably, or within the week, depending if we get some more heat. So again, now we'll move to a vinifera, going Chardonnay. So again, you can see everything bumps up. The Marquette, they get down to about -30, -31, but the vinifera or the Chardonnay anyway, it usually gets down to about -24, -25. It doesn't deacclimate, or it doesn't acclimate nearly as fast as the Marquette. I just went back to the Marquette. You can see in some years, we've got -30 even in December. So it can get down, it can acclimate quite quickly, whereas the Chardonnay is a little bit more gradual. These are fairly tight. You will notice that this year, it actually got a little hardier than most years. It got down to -25, -26. It got there kind of early in January, and it stayed there. Again, you'll notice the June frost year was one of its hardier years starting off. And again, you'll notice that it's deacclimated more than in past years. It's that solid line's above the other lines. So finally, the Riesling. This is a good cultivar variety to contrast with the Marquette. So Marquette's one of our earliest vines to break. It's one of our shortest season vines, whereas the Riesling is probably one of our last to break, and it also requires probably the longest season. Now you can see again the June frost year, it started out the hardiest. And another thing I'll mention, because it's a late breaking vine, it's actually not that far ahead than the other ones. The other ones are faster to break. The Riesling, it needs a lot more heat to break, and it really hasn't. Even though we've got the heat just like the other cultivars with this one, it doesn't recognize it as much. It needs more heat to break than the other ones, I should say. So it's not above past years. What is interesting with the Riesling is, again, it's our longest season cultivar probably that we have any number of. And you can see in past years, it's usually considered a hardy vinifera, but in here it's not that. In Nova Scotia, it's usually not that hardy. It's usually not any hardier than the Chardonnay or say the Pinot Noir, other vinifera. But you can see, so you can see usually it's only hardy down to about -23 or -24. But interestingly, this past year, it was quite a bit hardier. You can see it got down to -25, in January, and especially later in the season, it was, a good 3 or 4, even 5 degrees hardier than it was in past years. And why this is, we can only speculate, but it probably is because last year was one of the best years we've had, at least in the last 3 years, in terms of the length of the season. We didn't have any huge damaging frost, and also we had a lot of heat. So just look at that. If you look at the last 3 years, and Jeff's going to speak more about growing degree days than I am, but you can see last year we only had about 1,000 growing degree days from April to end of October. Compared to this, or no, 2 years ago, 2019, we had 1,000. Compared to last growing season, we had over 1,200. So that's pretty significant. Over 20% more heat last year, and the Riesling enjoyed that, and they were more dormant and happy because of it. And I expect they're going to do fairly well, barring anything bad happening climate-wise. They should be set up pretty well this year. So again, I just thought I'd quickly talk about high temperature exotherms. We always talk about low temperature exotherms. So essentially, I've talked to most of you about this before. When we measure the hardiness of these buds, we put the buds in a freezer, we freeze them, and when they freeze, they release heat, and we call that an exotherm. But we actually get two. We don't really talk about the high temperature exotherms very much. So if you see the schematic of some cells, in between the cells is where the extracellular water is. Now in the cells is where the intracellular water is. Now when the extracellular water freezes first, it's still super cool because it's in a small little bud, and it's fairly compact. And it can super cool a little bit, and it usually freezes, but it's a non-lethal freeze. So this water freezes first. It usually happens at around -5 or -10 degrees. We get this large peak usually on the thermograms, which is where we look at the temperature versus the heat given off, which is measured as a voltage in an instrument that we use to measure bud hardiness. So we usually get this big peak, -5, -10, and that's the high temperature exotherm. It's at the warmer temperature. When we get those lower peaks at the colder temperatures, that's the intracellular water freezing. That's what's lethal to the bud. When that freezes, then the bud's dead. It can't come back from that. Again, that's the low temperature exotherm. So just to see, this is a thermogram. This is something I took this out of a publication. This is something that we'd see. So you can see, the temperature on the right starts at 0, and we're going to left for cooler. So we start at 0 and we start stepping down, I think, about 4 degrees at a time. And you can see this first thing that freezes is around -6 or 7 in this particular one, and that's the high temperature exotherm. And again, it happens around -5 or -10. Then all those little bumps down below that you see between -20 and -25, those are low temperature exotherms. But of course, this time of year, as it deacclimates, these buds start migrating over closer to the high temperature exotherm, and they look fairly similar. Jeff says I think he can tell them apart, but anyway, it starts to get a little bit confusing when we start mixing our LTs and our HTs. If I've said something wrong, I'm sure Jeff will correct me. He's the one that actually picks the peaks every week. I'll now mention bud viability. So I won't mention too much about this, but I figured we just give you a little snapshot. We've only been doing it for 2 years, and we only started in January of last year. We don't do as often as the bud survey. It's every 4 weeks, and I'll just look at this last year's. So where to start in this plot? I guess, yeah, so I took some measurements from December, or first week of December, and then I compared some viability ratings from April. And again, this is a subset of the sites that we use in the bud hardiness survey. It's not quite as many, but we have 5 Luckett sites, 3 Marquette sites, 4 Chardonnay, and so on. And the first stands for the primary bud. We assess the primary bud, and the second stands for the secondary bud. We also assess the secondary bud. So you can see it started out pretty good in December. Out of our 5 sites, Luckett buds were about 97% viable, and nothing really changed. This is an extremely mild winter. They never froze. I think the coldest temperature we got at Kempfel might have been -16, or I don't know if it maybe hit -17. Jeff could probably speak to that better. So it only went down to about -96. Now I should mention that these buds can die for reasons other than low temperatures, and we'll see a little bit of that in some of the varieties down below. But the Marquette, I was kind of surprised at. Again, these buds aren't freezing, but they are dying for some reason. So they started out about 98%. And then they slowly drifted down over to April to about 91%. And so they did lose, 7% of their buds are no longer viable, which was interesting because this is one of our hardiest ones. But the reason they're dying, I don't think, is because of low temperatures, but it could be some other factor. The Chardonnay, again, also lost some viability, was 97%. And it dropped down to 91%. The Pinot Noir, somewhat surprisingly, we only have 2 sites, but they're good sites. It never lost anything over the year. They were still 98% here in April. And finally, the Riesling, they also had a pretty good year. It started out at 95 and 93. Now, I made a deal about the Marquette and Chardonnay, but we still have greater than 90% viability, which is, that's pretty high viability. Keep in mind, last year we did have a freeze event, some sites in February 15th. And we had a few sites, including in the Kentville Vineyard, that went from 98% in January. Then after the February event, they dropped down to less than 10%. Some of them were less than 5%. So on average, yeah, we started out pretty viable buds, and we ended up with pretty viable buds as well. So that's all I'll say about that. So I guess I did want to end on one note. I said these buds are viable, like we got 90% viability. For all cultivars at the end of the dormant season, which we're at now, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to break. I mean, there's a variety of factors that causes buds to break. They're not there; they have potential to break, but there's other factors that could keep all the buds from breaking. We don't usually have 90% plus buds break. Usually, there's a higher percentage of blind nodes than that. This past year, I think we were, in some of the blocks I saw 30 or 40% blind nodes. So. Good thing to keep in mind is the number. It does depend on the vigor of the vine and how many nodes you lay down. The more nodes you lie down, usually, even though most of those nodes might have viable buds, usually the percentage of blind buds also increases. So finally, I just thought I'd end by talking about freeze damage around bud break. We have the frost fan now. Jeff and I are itching to use it. We're waiting for a freeze event, and we're all wondering, what's lethal for buds right now, and the stages right now that are kind of in between, a dormant bud and bud break. So here's just some examples. So this is late bud swell. We like to use the EL system. There's a nice system. It's all based on EL numbers. So right now at late bud swell, and there's some buds that are approaching that will be here pretty soon. The LT10 is usually around -3. Now this is just generally, it depends on the cultivar and other factors. Depends how damp the buds are as well. For bud burst, it's about -2 is when you start seeing damage. For one leaf out, it's also -2. But you can see the LT50s and the LT90s are a little bit, got lower again from the earlier EL stage. And finally, once you have 2 or 3 leaves out, then you can start seeing damage even at 0 degrees, somewhere between 0 and -1. You start seeing damage. I mean, once these get out, the percentage of water goes up. Their leaf or their surface area to volume ratio increases quite a bit, so they quickly take on the temperature of the surrounding air, and they become quite sensitive. Yeah, and that concludes it.
Thank you very much, Harrison, for your presentation. If
No
you
problem.
have any questions, please take a look to the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen, and you can write and we can ask to Harrison. Harrison, I have a question related to your results.
Yep.
Have you been able to correlate the production of each year and the bud hardiness? Have you had the chance to see that?
We haven't looked into that specifically. Like you're saying, like on years with really heavy crops, do we see the bud hardiness, go down? No, and I think it's quite dynamic. I mean, you've seen a little bit, like I alluded to that in the frost year. That was a year that had a very light crop. And so it started out being quite a hardy year, like in December. It was harder than most years, mostly because the crop was down. I think we calculated about 55%. and that's what I attributed it to. But you see, it didn't actually push it to any deeper acclimations than normal. I mean, that was this past year. So yeah, it is a factor. I mean, we're still trying to figure out all the different types of correlations like that, but crop load definitely is a factor. If you have a really big crop that year, probably your vines are not going to be a hardy. All those photosynthetates and everything are going to be sucked up by the fruit, and the canes are probably going to be left wanting a little bit.
Perfect. Thank you, Harrison. If nobody else has any question, I would like to say thanks again, Harrison, for such a nice presentation. Thank you both, Harrison and Jeff, from all this work that you do through the growing season, because it's very nice to see all this information and how helpful it is for taking decisions as well. So thank you very much. So now I would like to invite Jeff Franklin to listen his update of the climatic conditions.
Well, thank you, Francisco. Always excited to come and talk about weather, about our historical weather set. It's definitely something I can be quite passionate about. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Once again, thank you for attending tonight. Give us a chance to speak. So this is just my title slide here, and what I've got. The picture I show in the background is the actual weather compound at the Kemptville Research Development Center. It is the site. It's jointly operated by us and Environment and Climate Change Canada. They provide the instrumentation, we provide the land and some of the maintenance, and we share the data. So when I talk tonight about temperature data, precipitation data, it's coming from here. It's coming from right behind the research station. This is just up the hill behind the heating plant. Quite a picturesque little site there. Okay, so let's just start with temperature. Starting from the 1st of January on to this morning, looking at the temperature trends that we've had here in Kemptville. So in this graph, the black dots are the daily observed mean temperatures. The gray line that runs through those is the 10-year trend line. And I use the 10-year trend line to show what we would expect for temperatures, where we expect the temperature to be based on 10 years of historical data. So as you can see, I filled out a couple areas here. So the winter started off, and I'm sure we all remember this. Everybody was saying all through January, and maybe up to the first week of February, are we even going to have winter this year? You know, maybe winter won't show up, because it was beautiful. It was much warmer than average, very pleasant temperatures. And of course, by the first week of February, it became obvious, no, we were definitely going to get winter. And we had kind of hung into, I would say, 5-6 weeks of below average temperature there from about the first week of February on to about the middle of March. And then you can see here, on about the middle of March, things started to improve. We went well above average, and it's this time that's really given us the observed phenology that we're seeing in terms of bud development right now. This is where things start to take off, and it doesn't matter which statistic we look at, whether we look at ground temperature or air temperature, we were well above average. And then we actually came into by about the end of April, we came to more average temperature. This is still slightly above average, but we had a closer to average. And I think most people, you know, when I tell them that we've had such an above average year, they say, well, wait a second, but you know, I've been cold lately. And some of that's, of course, we've had a little bit less solar radiation in the last 2 weeks. We had a lot of cloudy days, and we're certainly moving closer to that average line. But one thing that did start to happen in here, and another advantage that the bud hardiness survey brings us, is on or about the 26th of April, we began to notice some very early, very minor bud swelling. We saw it in Luckett, we saw it in some of the other hybrids, didn't notice it in vinifera at all. So I'm marking on this graph, and I'll update this graph as we go on through the season, but this is kind of the beginning of bud swell. And this is quite a bit ahead of what we saw last year. So from just looking at average temperature, we can take that concept a little farther. We look at growing degree days, or degree. When we talk about degree days, of course, we're talking about the observation of temperature over time. So there's a time factor there. And we talk about growing degree days, we talk about how much of that heat would be available for plant development. Now, I know it's typical, and most people, you're looking at the title of that slide, we usually use a base of 10 degrees Celsius when we talk about grape phenology, grape development, but there's certainly strong evidence in the literature that when we're just talking about bud break, we're talking about those very early stages, that 5 degrees is a more appropriate measure. So that's what I have here. These are accumulated heat units. So this is just the accumulation of heat over time. So you can see in this graph, the bright red line here is 2021. That's the current year, and it runs right up to May 6th. So the obvious trend here is that we're, from about the middle of March up to now, we've been above average. And the dotted black line in here is the average, the 10-year average, and we're well ahead of that line. And of course, I think we're seeing that in terms of development of everything. I mean, whether you're talking about the forsythia or your daffodils, everything seems to have been a little bit advanced this year. And although there's many years on this graph, there's a couple that should be of interest. One is, of course, last year, 2020, this blue line down here, we weren't really doing very well at all. Now, having said that, it turned out to be a spectacular year. So the degree of heat that we get in the spring isn't necessarily a make or break deal in terms of the success of the crop. But of course, for us to correct this last year, we had to have an incredibly warm June, July, and August to make up for it, which we received, and everything came early, Veraison harvest and all that. But where we seem to be closer to, if you look at this graph, we seem to be very close to the 2017, 2018 trajectory. And so that's both advantageous, and of course it comes with some risks, and we'll talk about those in a couple of slides here. But anyway, take home message from this slide: we're ahead in terms of heat. So let's look at precipitation. In the weather compound in Kentville, we don't just measure rainfall, we measure rainfall and what we call rainfall equivalent. And rainfall equivalent is the amount of snow converted to an equivalent amount of precipitation. And so by doing that, we get a better measure of total season precipitation, which is, of course, the precipitation that happened 2 weeks ago has an immediate impact on plants, but the precipitation that happened all through the winter also has an impact on how things grow and how much water we've been able to accumulate in reservoirs and so on and so forth. But just to look at some of the trends in the winter. So we didn't really get much winter at all till about the 1st of February. We had a significant snowfall. I think it's end of January, early February in here. That didn't last very long. 7 days later, that was gone. And I know I was doing the bud hardness survey and walking through vineyards where we were down to bare ground. But by about the first week, end of the first week, I think it was the 8th of February, we had another significant snowfall in here. And that became the beginning of what I'll call Kentville's official winter. And after that, we had about 5 weeks of snow cover. And if you could go back to that temperature graph, the 5 weeks of snow cover coincided with the roughly 5 weeks of below average temperature. And I would suggest that, we always talk about, we know what the winter season is, it's roughly 3 months long, but I would argue that we got out of this winter with only about 5-6 weeks of winter weather, which in my mind is incredibly short. Certainly in my very brief lifetime, I've got to see this change dramatically in how much actual winter weather we get in the winter season. And by about the 15th of March, the snow had all abated at the research station. We actually have the snow depth sensors. We have 3 of them, so we can average them to account for drifting. And from that point on, including up to now, we were bare ground. And of course, that has a profound impact for how fast soils heat up. So the other thing I should show you here. So the bright red line again is 2021. Since we only really had these 2 big snowfall events, there were some other small ones, we didn't get a lot of precipitation through the winter. And as you can see, the black line here is the 10-year average, the 10-year mean of accumulated precipitation that we would have had by this time. And we've been running behind that. The red line is this year, essentially through the whole winter and spring. Right up to about now, where it looks like we may actually catch up to the average, which is good. it is not good to run out of water early in the season. If you look at this 10-year trend line, one thing you notice about it, it slopes down a little bit. We can see already that as we move through the season into June and July, we get less precipitation per month. So it's important that we get as much as we can in these months in terms of filling reservoirs and filling the water table. So just to show you here in comparison, so 2021 and 2020 in terms of precipitation, early season, very similar. We've almost been in lockstep with 2020. But 2019, we all remember, was the year that the rainfall would stop, the ground just wouldn't dry up. And of course, that's this thick yellow line up here, and we're a long ways from that. That year we had problems. There was too much moisture in the ground, lots of problems, cool soils, lots of problems for development. And we're not there. We're a much more preferred situation this year, getting very close to average precipitation levels. And of course, that all leads into soil temperatures. So these are soil temperatures taken in ChemFL in the same weather compound. And we take soil temperatures from 5 centimeters down to 2 meters. So this is at the 35 centimeter level. And I've chosen that because it's a good level if you want to talk about the temperature of the soil in the root zone. Again, 2021 is the bright red line in here. And as you can see, once again, by the time we lost our snow in the middle of March, it took about a week, and then we began to see warming actually at the 30 centimeter level. That's good. Lots of solar radiation. And this time of year, solar radiation drives ground temperatures more than anything else. So even on cool days, you can get net heating of deeper soil levels just through solar radiation. And that kind of plays along. And you see these cycles in the data this year, or you see the cycle in the temperatures in all years. And that's because as systems move through, we get cloudy days, soil temperatures drop, clouds go away, sun comes out, soil temperatures come back up. And we'll get this constant cycling as long as we have this sort of typical spring. Every 3-4 days, system moves through and gives us a couple of days of cloudy weather. And that's brought us this year. So currently, as of this morning, we were somewhere between 9 and 10 degrees at 30 centimeters. And that's actually a very good result. And we certainly have had some years where we didn't hit 10 degrees till the end of May. And it looks like we're gonna be there at any time. That's critically important for heating of the root zone and making the plants able to absorb nutrients. And so as we put on our fertilizer applications or any other ground-based amendments, the roots fairly soon will be ready to begin to absorb those. And we should hopefully see fewer nutrition deficiencies this year, provided that you're doing all the other stages of management. Some years it almost doesn't matter. You put your soil amendments on at the same time. Soil temperature is so cold that very little of it is actually available to the plant. But this year we should be in good shape. So all good news. I mean, those are all positives. And it brings us to the stage. How is this actually impacting the bud? So 3 pictures of buds here. From left to right, there are Luckett, Marquette, and Chardonnay. Now, if you don't study them too closely, you think they all look the same, but there are some subtle differences. So I would call these all mostly EL2, but if you look closely at this Marquette bud here in the center, we have a little green spot starting to show there. And of course, it's that woolly bud and a little bit of green showing that defines the EL level 3. And we expect to see that in Marquette before we see it in the other varieties. Marquette is more precocious. I don't think that the Luckett is that far behind. And really what's quite interesting is Chardonnay isn't really that far behind either. I mean, this is the Chardonnay bud is definitely an EL2 bud, but it's not that far behind the others, at least in appearance at this point. Certainly the bud scales are broken, the bud is definitely swollen. I didn't pick the most advanced buds in our block. These are buds from our own research vineyard. I tried to pick buds that were closer to average. So Harrison made mention of this, and I think it's true. I think for Marquette, by the weekend, it wouldn't surprise me if we see a significant number of buds that are at the bud break stage. And that's quite early. When I look back, we have a short data set on, not on Marquette, but on Lucy Coolin we got from a cooperating grower. And I think the earliest we've seen bud break in that variety, Lucy Coolin, is May 5th, and that was in 2012. If anybody remembers 2012, it was an incredibly warm year. And we're not very far behind that. Marquette and Lussacum are fairly similar in terms of timing of bud break. So yeah, we're definitely seeing early bud break. And of course, the good news, as Harrison said, even though we're at this stage, there still is some acclimation in terms of the buds. They're not all that vulnerable. So if I may just speak quickly, let's talk a little bit about frost risk, because of the other side of the equation, how fast are things growing? Of course, what's our frost risk? Because that's really the one disadvantage to having fast development, advanced development, is that your vulnerability increases too, and so does your risk. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but if people want to ask questions about this. So this is the observation of the last spring frost for every year since we've been keeping records at the Kentville Research Station. So that's since 1914. Right up to 2020 was the last observation in this data set. So each one of these black dots represent the day of the year where the last spring frost occurred. Just as an example, so we all remember this one. This is 2018. So the last frost we observed that year was day 155 or June 4th. That was the last freezing temperature of the spring season. And so all these other dots are also the last freezing temperature, or last occurrence of 0 degrees that we saw in each of those years. So if you ignore all the red lines, forget about those for a moment, just look at the black dots. You can't help but notice that the whole thing is trending downward. So we're moving to an earlier day, which means that the day of the year with the last frost is actually becoming earlier every year. And if we want to put some math to this, we want to maybe make a predictive model. So that's really what this dark red line does. It shows me, roughly how much that trend is decreasing over time. And it brings me up to, in 2021, we would predict on average that the last frost would be on or around May the 7th. But of course, with data like this, there are so many other factors besides just time, weather systems, year-to-year variations, all kinds of things that give you these variability. I mean, all of our, whoops, sorry, let me go back there. All of our frosts don't just happen on one single day. We have this cluster of points around this average line. And so we can put some metrics to that too, and give a reasonable estimation of what our frost risk is. So I've set two zones, sort of an 85% probability and then a 15% probability. So the high probability, 85% of the observations fall between this line and this line. And the remaining 50% fall between the very top and the bottom line. So in that way, we can get an idea as we go from a high probability of frost to a lower probability of frost. So that's I tell you all this just to explain the next slide. So, and this is historically speaking. This is not considering any specific weather systems that may be headed our way. We have an 85% chance of the last frost falling between April 23rd and May 24th. So that's a little over 2 weeks from now, 85% chance that we will see a frost between April 23rd and May 24th. So beyond that, and we all know that frost can happen later than that because we just lived through one, 100% chance of seeing the last frost falling between April 14th and June 4th. But of course, that wider time period has much lower probability of actually having a frost occur. So certainly, I'm looking at the trajectory of our buds, the stage that they're at now, the vulnerability, which is they're still fairly well acclimated. We're forecast to have slightly below average temperatures for the next 2 weeks. So I'm hoping that we'll get through most of this next 2 weeks up to May 24th with our buds still having some degree of hardiness, so that a 0 degree, a very quick frost wouldn't do much damage. Having said that, I know that we're going to see some green tissue starting to show up, and maybe some people are already starting to see it. And maybe if people have a chance to leave that as a comment in the Q&A session, I'm curious to see if other people are seeing any green tissue in their vineyards as well. So that's all I have. Francisco's saying phew. I'm sure that was more than 10 minutes, but.
No comments. But thank you very much, Jeff. It was a very interesting and complete presentation. And I have a question for you.
Sure.
2012 and 2013 low precipitation years. Did these correlate with earlier harvest dates?
So one caveat is I certainly didn't work in grapes back in 2012. I worked in apples, and certainly, and the problem is that this is a tough measurement to make because low precipitation years are high solar radiation years, high temperature years. So 2012, not only did we not have a lot of rain, the temperatures in May were in the 20s most days. So that advanced everything. I know in the crop I was working at that time, which was apple, we definitely had our early harvest that year. We saw harvest of some popular varieties started in August, which was almost unheard of. But of course, in apple, once you get to the blossom period, you just count the number of days to harvest beyond that. Grapes are a little different. I would expect we would have seen, had we been, and I know people were growing grapes, probably seen a more profound difference in grapes in that year, where heat can actually advance development right through veraison and all those other stages. So I would have to say I would anticipate it, but I can't verify it.
Thank you. Yeah. No more questions.
So if there's no more questions, I guess thanks very much, Jeff. Glad you included that soil one, because, you know, I love to talk about soil temperature and getting the roots active and everything. So I appreciate you including that in there. But no, that's good news. And I love seeing those comparisons between 16 and 17, because I would argue, I think Marcel will probably agree with me, those are probably our last two complete growing years, right? Where we kind of had those good growing years from start to finish. And there's some challenges, but look back on those years with fond memories, that's for sure. And looking forward to maybe one that we could mimic, especially that 17 year. So I think there's a lot of good news there, but with the frost thing, we're probably all tippy-toeing around a little bit with the way the buds are swelling up. But no, great observations for sure. So now we'll move on to Francisco's going to give us a presentation on some things that are happening and going to be happening very soon in the vineyard. Go ahead, Francisco.
Thank you, Steve. Good evening, everyone. Today I will be talking about vineyard activities. For people who doesn't know me, my name is Francisco Diez, and I am the viticulture specialist at Perennial. So this time I will be correlating a little bit our presentation, as we have done in previous years, with the discussion at the end of this presentation. So this time I would like to talk with you about pruning, some priorities, especially after listening Jeff, and what we do with the pruning wood. Also, I would like to talk about the soil work. Something that we have to keep in mind all the time is de-healing vines and what we can do in the interrows. And the favorite topic of my friend Marcel Kolb is sprayers and sprays. So we'll be talking a little bit about calibrations, material available, and the first applications. So pruning. Before starting the pruning, I would like to ask you a question. Which percentage of your vineyard is pruned? Okay. Please encourage you to answer. This is completely anonymous, so we'll see all the numbers. So for people who is watching the replay and cannot watch the poll, the question is, which percentage of your vineyard is pruned? And the options are 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100%. Okay, so I will wait other 30 seconds just to see if we have some extra answers before moving forward with the rest of the presentation. Ten more seconds if somebody else wants to answer. Okay. So here you have the results. We had 9 persons vote, And the 56% has already finished the pruning. 75%, it's a very good number for 33%, and 11% is the 50. So interesting to see. So pruning. Well, if we haven't done the pruning or we are in the half, we should be giving some priorities. And the priorities should be the earliest ones, such as Lucie Kuhlmann, Marquette, and Bac Noir. Jeff already mentioned that some grower has data saying that even May 5th was the earliest for Lucie Kuhlmann. So something to keep in mind. Other varieties to consider are Frontenac, Geisenheim, and Luckett. These varieties are historically having early bud break. Okay, so this should be the priorities. Later, the latest varieties that we have registered usually here in Nova Scotia are Pinot Noir and Riesling. So pay attention which varieties are in your vineyard to make a strategy, because pruning is a process which takes time, and bud burst is coming. So these two photos are from last week. On the top, you can see Castel, and down, you can see Chardonnay. And if you pay attention here to the circle, you can see how it was moving the subflow. Meanwhile, Chardonnay didn't have nothing actually. So please keep records of vine phenology. That will be crucial to be able to be taking better decisions in our vineyard and to be able to take the best strategy. Maybe you have only hybrids, but some hybrids that can be earlier than others. So it's important to keep in mind that information. So before moving, I would like to ask you, do you track vine phenology? Again, anonymous are all the answers. So the options are yes, no, and sometimes. Again, I will repeat the question in case somebody is watching the replay and they cannot watch the poll question. Our question was, do you track vine phenology? The options are yes, no, and sometimes. So I will give some extra seconds, 20 more seconds. If somebody else wants to answer. Okay, we end up pulling and show the results. So we have a 44% tracking the phenology, 22% no, and a 33% sometimes. It's a good number. I will encourage you to continue tracking the phenology of the vines, because it's something very important and crucial and useful to be taking better decisions in our vineyard. So let's go back to the presentation. Pruning wood options will be depending on health conditions. So many people like to incorporate to the soil the wood, but in the cases when the vines are not in the best conditions with some diseases, or for example, any kind of fungal disease which can stay there, or even crown gall, it will be a good idea to take out from the vineyard and eliminate. And also some people like to keep it out for frost protection. So you can see in these pictures on the left how one strategy to be doing with the pruning wood is to leave in one row clean, and the next door you keep the wood. So if you want to take out the wood from the vineyard, it's definitely easier. Or if you want to incorporate the wood, you will have a spread in one row. So one row will do work with the soil, and the other will have the cover crop, so you can pass and move with your tractor. So let's go to the soil work. And the first is the healing vines. So especially in grafted Vitis vinifera varieties, because when you have grafted, you have to pay attention to the union point, or the graft union between the scion and the rootstock, and this should be protected. So now in the next couple of weeks, if you have your vinifera varieties grafted or even hybrid grafted, you will have to be cleaning the soil from the graft union. And also it's a good way to clean the weeds from below the vines in case you are having some kind of population. So here on the left, you can see a row without dehilling the vines. You can see drier and more solid the soil. So on the right, we can see both the different cases. On the left, you can see how are the rows without dehealing. Meanwhile, on the right, you can see the dehealing process. And you can see how it changed even the color, you can see the moisture, and that also will help some aeration and increase of temperature. So soil work inter rows. Well, keep this section with cover crop short and under control. Always to have the cover crop in a good condition and in a way that you can manage, just avoiding to have an overpopulation or to have the flowers. Otherwise, through the season will be more difficult. If compaction is present, it's possible to subsoil or till every second row. That's something to keep in mind, because when you have some kind of compaction, you will see the plants growing less, and you can pay attention to one of the minerals in your tissue analysis, especially manganese. If you have high levels of manganese, that can mean you have some compaction and low aeration in your soil. So pay attention in the petioles, and if you think you have compaction, it will be necessary to subsoil or till. The pruning wood can be incorporated when the material has good health condition, as we already discussed. And important, keep in consideration erosion and cover crop protection through the season, because even though we are taking out the soil, tilling, or more, we'll have to put a cover crop through the season to avoid the impact of the rain, erosion, and also to allow the tractors to move and pass through without issues. So I would like to ask you my last question of today, and is, what do you do with your pruning wood? So the first option is incorporate. The second is take out and eliminate. Third is keep it for frost protection. And the last one, other. So again, I will repeat the question for the people who is watching the replay. The question is, what do you do with your pruning wood? And the options are incorporation. Second, take out and eliminate. Third, keep it for frost protection. Last one, other. Okay. Because I have the same people answering, I will end the polling right now. So take out and eliminate, it's a 56%. And we have a draw between incorporation and keep it for frost protection with a 22% respectively. So thank you very much for your participation. I don't have more questions now. So inter rows, you can see in this example how the grower has been working every second row. And you can see how looks the soil with a good humidity. This place had some compaction, so it was necessary to work. But the other two rows, they have their cover crop. Through in a couple of weeks, they will be putting some cover crop, the seeds, a very nice combination. This will not be a bare soil. It's just to allow the soil to have a good aeration at the beginning of the season. And also this will enhance the temperature. So it will be slightly faster the bud burst and the activity of the plant at the beginning of the season. Sorry. So sprayers and sprays, well, calibration, something very important and crucial. At the beginning of the season, you have to calibrate before starting all the applications. So take a look of, check the hoses, the nozzles, the tanks, the tires, etc., because everything will have an impact. After you check everything, evaluate and measure the sprayer working according to the seasonal conditions. So in that way, you can be sure that you have your equipment working in a proper way. So we have some material available, and related to sprayers, we have done a webinar of perennial. My colleague Thomas Harrington did on April 13 the calibrating sprayers with rate controllers. It's a very nice presentation. It's slightly long, but it's worth it to watch to pay attention to the details. Podcast of perennial, my colleague Michelle Cortens has a podcast, and in the last couple of months, she did two interviews to Dr. Jason DeVoe, who has it's called With the Sprayer Guy, and he has a lot of information. I will encourage you to listen both of them. And if you see each podcast, when you see the description, you will find more information available. Related to options to be applied through the season, from the AGM of last year, we had Dr. Kevin Kerr, and he did great pesticide choices 2021 dealing with registration changes. We have this presentation online available. He gives a very good summary of what is available and what is not, and giving also potential strategies to afford this season. Omafra also did a very nice publication a couple of weeks ago, which is like a summary of what Kevin Kerr did. This is done by Ryan Webster, I think is, and it's very good. It's a very nice summary. And also we have the Perennia Grape Guide. This was published also a couple of months ago with the products available in the area or potential options for the season. All this material will be published on the Grape blog, so I encourage you to subscribe to the blog. There you will have all the links and all the information to listen and to read every section. Last but not least is the first application. So these are optional applications for bud burst, and it can be lime sulfur for suppression of powdery mildew, anthracnose, and scale insects, or also it can be oil applications for scale insects. Remember, these are optionals because depending how are your local conditions. If you have a powdery mildew or anthracnose, it will be encouraged to apply to have better management. If you don't have, you don't have to, all in case you think it's necessary. And last, always before applying any product to your vineyard, please read the product, because if you're organic, be sure that it's organic. If depending the stage of your vine, take a look what is the recommendation and which are the doses. Thank you for your attention. If you have any question, please feel free to contact me at fts@perennia.ca. So this is for me was like an introduction to our topic and discussion between these two growers that I'm very curious to listen about your observations, Marcel and Steve. For people who doesn't know Marcel Kolb, he is the vineyard manager at Luckett's Vineyard. He has a vast experience working in Nova Scotia, very good professional, an excellent person. And Steve Ells is the president of GGANS, as well the owner of Ellslea Farms. So Marcel, I would like to ask you your main observations of the pruning of these last winter, or maybe even till now.
Well, we did see quite a few early jumps, and I'm glad this actually correlates what Jeff has been telling with the temperatures. We did see some movement in the wood, like as late as late February. Definitely seen a change there starting. That kind of slowed down for a little bit, and in March we saw another little jump in the wood, and from then on it just kept on steady going. Like it seemed like it never stopped. It was just creeping all the time. So it definitely looks earlier than last year, which is exciting to see. But overall, very good wood, very little bud damage throughout all the varieties, very, very low percentages. So we should see a lot of primary buds pushing this year.
Thank you. I'm glad to listen. Very positive comments and the nice surprises. And Steve, how can you see yours?
A lot the same as Marcel's. Yeah, we saw some little bit of sap moisture there very early on. We were a little surprised to see it actually. And the buds have, one thing that was a little surprising, and I think Marcel alluded to it as well, is we saw that slow swelling, and the slow swelling started surprisingly early this year, but it really does fit in with what Jeff was showing with that early warm up and coming out of dormancy. So, so yeah, and the buds look good. They're definitely swelled up now. A lot of our stuff is swelled up now, so tying's getting a little careful and tricky, but it's good. a lot of good wood. I think this is the best wood we've seen since the tie down of 18 before the June frost. And it's interesting too, because when you think back to even what Harrison was showing there, it's always interested me when you look at the year before, when you look at all that data on bud hardiness and viability and everything, and you think back to the season before and how much heat we got and what the crop load was and how healthy the vines were, how much disease pressure we had. And we think back to last year, what a good year we had for disease pressure and heat units and everything. And I look at the buds this year and I look at the green in the wood, you know, and the pith, and it's definitely looking the best since we had that tie down for 18, I think.
Would you agree as well, Marcel, about this?
I definitely would. Yes, I was actually just thinking today I should pull out the 17 data and just have a look and see how close we are to that year. Yeah, I think it's fairly close.
Yeah, I have the same impression, especially after observing the values.
I think we're very close.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to ask you now, Steve, about soil work. Are you doing any special soil work, or how is your healing? What are you doing right now?
Yep. So just about everything that's tied down, we've gone through with the cultivator. I do, especially with the younger vines, I like to wait until it's tied down, just in case you get a young trunk that's over a little bit with the Grape hoe, the sensor arms. So probably about half the vineyard has been dehilled or cultivated. And probably we're about 2/3 through with the spader for the spring spading. We do a fall spading, very quick pass with the spader, just makes big chunks, and then a slow pass in the spring, so to kind of get everything fined back down and ready to seed. But we're definitely working our way through. It's kind of slow work, so it's hard to fit in with everything else. But yeah, we're definitely working away. And the soil looks great. Yeah, it's dry, it's great. I noticed even with the little bit of rain we got last week, I was just out of the soil work for about 24 hours and then right back in.
Marcel, how's everything with you?
Yeah, so I agree with Steve on that one. So we actually have not started with any groundwork yet. We just finished today actually with tying everything down. So as soon as this weather cycle is going through, we'll be out there and start ripping the ground, and there's a little bit of de-hilling to do as well. But mainly, yes, we'll just wait out the next weather cycle and then we'll be at it as well.
Perfect. And Marcel, are you going to be working winter rows? Are you going to be subsoiling?
Yeah, the de-hilling is going to be first. Get some air on that rootstock. And then after that, we'll be subsoiling every second row, which we usually do. We're on a 2-year cycle with our rows. So we'll be subsoiling, we'll be spading it, and we'll do a fine spade a little bit later or earlier in the summer, and then we'll cover crop it in. That will be our cover for the next 2 years till we start the cycle again.
Okay, perfect. So I would like to touch one of the favorite topics of Marcel Kolb. It's about the sprayers. And Marcel, how's everything with your sprayer? Have you calibrated your sprayer? Are you applying anything before bud bursts? How it works with you?
Well, funny you mention it. We haven't even pulled it out of the shop yet. So it's not a high priority on my mind right now. Yes, the spray plans have been done, absolutely, and this was the first thing. As soon as we saw some movement in the wood, that we had to start thinking of a possible early spray. So yes, the spray plan should be done by now. If you're, as a grower, have not had the time yet to do it, or you're not unsure of it, please contact your winery. I'm sure there is someone there that can help you with that. to figure out the plan for the year, or maybe have a backup emergency plan in case something should go rainy during the summer. But yes, it's time to start thinking about your spray plans, and then get your sprayer out and do your calibrations, look it over, make sure everything is top notch the way it should be, and get ready for the season. It's coming.
And Steve, how's everything with you?
Good, good. I'm only a slight step ahead of Marcel on that one, I guess. I've moved the sprayer out to where I can hook onto it, but I haven't actually hooked onto it yet. But it is sitting there ready to go, ready to get hooked on and checked over. I did fill up the water tank today. So, and we're looking at doing a selected lime sulfur dormant spray this year, just on some of the vinifera. I think last year was so good, and there's such little disease pressure. The hybrids, I'm not even going to think about lime sulfur on them to clean them up this year. Just be about 2/3 of the vinifera, I think, just as a little cleanup to get rid of stuff. But yeah, and I would agree with Marcel on thinking about that first spray, thinking about the products you want to use, get a plan. There's lots of people to talk to if you're not confident of making the plan yourself. There's good resources. Some of our vendors have good resources to help you with spray planning. You know, that you should be looking at it with the people that, or your sap samples or tissue samples from last year. Think about what micronutrients you want to get in there with the first couple sprays to get them started. Because it's, I know with us, and I think with Marcel too, it's definitely as much about micronutrients in the first couple sprays as it is a fungicide. And in fact, a lot of the hybrids won't get any fungicide for the first spray or two. It'll all just be about you know, boron and iron and some whatever micronutrients. Like we've already had a couple meetings with going over last year's results and making the plan for this year. So it's super important to get that plan in place and get the chemicals ordered. And I know, talking to vendors this year with everything that's happened over this last crazy 18 months in our world, that it's the year you want to be planning ahead. Sometimes these transport connections and everything are a little tricky. So you probably want to be thinking about what you're going to use for the next month and get it ordered.
Great, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Marcel and Steve, for this discussion. It's interesting to know your strategies and your main observations, because especially about the pruning, they have been tough years. I know you are actors of these things, so thank you very much. So Steve, I don't know if you would like to close up this session.
Sure. Yeah, well, it's been great getting this going again. It's always nice reaching out, and I know look forward to some comments after this. I always get a couple texts from people, good or bad, so always look forward to those. And we'll be working on the next session shortly. Don't have a firm date yet, but it's always off there kind of with the next growing stage. And I guess up to then, everyone have a great growing season and get the vines tied down and get ready for another year, because it's coming fast.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Harrison. Thank you, Marcel. And see you the next time.